Trump stole $160 billion from Canada. And for a long time, Canada let it happen. The tariffs piled up. The insults landed. The economic wounds deepened. Ottawa stayed quiet, stayed polite, stayed patient, until the day Mark Carney decided that patience had an expiration date. That date has now passed. And what Carney just put in motion will force Donald Trump to answer for every single dollar. If you're watching the news right now and you feel like something has shifted, like the air has changed, like the rules everyone agreed to play by just got thrown out the window, you are not imagining it. The world you woke up in this morning is not the same world it was 6 months ago, because something happened between Washington and Ottawa that the mainstream media is tiptoeing around, that the financial press is burying in technical language, and that most Americans have no idea is coming for them. A reckoning has begun. A demand has been made, and the man making it is not someone you ignore. You need to understand what is actually happening here, not the version they will give you in a 2-minute segment between commercials. The real version, the version with numbers in it, the version with history in it, the version that tells you exactly who did what to whom, exactly how much it cost, and exactly what is about to happen because of it. Because this story is not just about Canada. This story is about power. About what happens when the most powerful country in the world decides the rules no longer apply to it. And about what happens when the country it is crushing finally finds a leader with the nerve to say, enough. Let's go back. Not far. Just far enough to understand what the world looked like before this moment and why that world mattered. For nearly 8 decades, the global trading system operated on a set of assumptions so deeply embedded that most people stopped noticing them. The assumption was simple. Nations trade. Nations negotiate. Nations disagree. But nations do not weaponize commerce against their closest allies. Not openly. Not deliberately. Not as policy. The rules were written after World War II, codified through institutions like the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, and later the World Trade Organization, and enforced through something less formal but equally powerful. The understanding that economic aggression toward an ally was a form of betrayal. You did not bleed the people next door. Not if they were your friends. Not if they were your partners. Not if your economies were so intertwined that harming them meant, in some quiet and delayed way, harming yourself. Canada and the United States were not just trading partners. They were something closer than that. The two countries shared the longest undefended border in the world. They shared intelligence. They shared military alliances. They shared culture, language in most regions, family, history. The trade relationship between them was worth over $2 trillion annually, the largest bilateral trade relationship on the planet. Every single day, goods and people and money moved across that border in volumes that would have been unimaginable to any previous generation. The relationship was not perfect. It never was. But it was built on a foundation of mutual respect and mutual benefit. What one country needed, the other often supplied. What one country produced, the other often consumed. They were, in the truest economic sense, partners. That foundation did not crack gradually. It was dynamited. When Donald Trump returned to the White House in January 2025, he came back with an agenda that had no patience for partnerships, no interest in mutual benefit, and no respect for the agreements that had governed North American trade for decades. The United States-Mexico-Canada Agreement, the deal Trump himself had negotiated in his first term, the deal he had called a great victory, the deal that was supposed to define the economic relationship between the three neighbors, meant nothing. Within weeks of his return, Trump began imposing tariffs on Canadian goods that violated the very agreement he had championed. 25% tariffs on Canadian steel, 25% tariffs on Canadian aluminum, sweeping tariffs on Canadian automobiles, Canadian lumber, Canadian agricultural products. The justification shifted week to week, sometimes day to day. First, it was national security. Then it was trade deficits. Then it was fentanyl, a claim that Canadian officials and independent analysts disputed with documented evidence. pointing out that the overwhelming majority of fentanyl entering the United States came through the southern border, not the northern one. The justification was never really the point. The tariffs were the point. The economic pressure was the point. The message was the point. And the message was this: we are bigger than you. We are stronger than you. And we will take what we want. Pause. Here is what those tariffs actually meant in human terms. The Canadian steel and aluminum industries employed hundreds of thousands of workers in provinces like Ontario and Quebec. When American tariffs made Canadian metal artificially expensive in the American market, orders dried up. Plants reduced shifts. Workers were laid off. Communities that had built their entire economic identity around manufacturing watched that identity get dismantled by a policy decision made in Washington by people who had never visited those towns and had no intention of doing so. The auto sector, deeply integrated across the border, with parts crossing multiple times before a finished vehicle rolled off the line, was thrown into chaos. Canadian auto workers, American auto workers, the entire supply chain that had been built over decades of careful cooperation, all of it disrupted by tariffs that treated the border like a wall instead of a seam. The economic damage was not abstract. It was measured. Canadian economists, the Bank of Canada, independent trade analysts, all of them began running the numbers. And the numbers were staggering. The cumulative economic cost to Canada of American tariff policy under Trump's second term, the lost trade, the suppressed investment, the disrupted supply chains, the industries hollowed out by artificial barriers, was calculated in the range of $160 billion. $160 billion. That is not a rounding error. That is not a minor adjustment. That is the systematic extraction of wealth from a sovereign nation by its most powerful neighbor, conducted not through war, not through sanctions, but through the deliberate abuse of economic leverage. When you steal from someone with a gun, we call it robbery. When you steal from someone with a tariff, we call it policy. But the money has gone either way. Slower now. Now let's talk about the man who decided to stop pretending this was acceptable. Mark Carney is not a politician in the traditional sense. He did not come up through the party machinery, did not spend decades in parliament, did not build his career on the rhythms of electoral cycles. Mark Carney is something rarer and in many ways more dangerous to his opponents. He is a man who genuinely understands money. Not the way politicians understand money, as a talking point, as a campaign promise, as a number on a podium. He understands it the way a surgeon understands anatomy. He knows where the arteries are. He knows where the pressure points are. He knows exactly what happens when you cut off the flow. Carney spent years at Goldman Sachs before entering public service. He served as governor of the Bank of Canada during the 2008 financial crisis and guided his country through the global collapse with a steadiness that earned him international recognition. Then, in an almost unprecedented move, he was recruited to serve as governor of the Bank of England, the first non-British citizen to hold that position in the institution's 300-year history. He managed Britain through the chaos of Brexit, through the currency shocks, through the uncertainty that sent markets into convulsions. He did not panic. He did not grandstand. He worked. When he finally entered Canadian politics and became the leader of the Liberal Party, he brought with him something that no other political figure in Canada could credibly claim: a resume that made Donald Trump's economic arguments look like they were written on a napkin. Because here is the thing about arguing economics with Mark Carney. You cannot bluff him. You cannot dazzle him with numbers he doesn't understand. You cannot claim the tariffs are good for trade and expect him to nod politely. He has forgotten more about international monetary policy than most finance ministers will ever know. And when he looked at what Trump had done to Canada, really looked with the full weight of his training and experience, what he saw was not a negotiating posture. What he saw was theft. Let this land. Carney became Prime Minister in March 2025, taking over from Justin Trudeau at a moment when Canada was desperate for exactly the kind of leadership he represented. And he wasted no time. Within weeks of taking office, he made clear that Canada's approach to the Trump tariff regime was changing. Gone was the careful diplomatic language. Gone was the deference. Gone was the posture that said, "We disagree, but we respect the relationship, and we will work through channels." What replaced it was something Canadians had not heard from their government in a long time: clarity, directness, a refusal to pretend that what was happening was anything other than what it was. Carney stood before the Canadian Parliament and said, in language that left no room for misinterpretation, that Canada would not be intimidated, would not be absorbed, and would not continue absorbing economic punishment without consequence. He authorized a package of retaliatory tariffs against American goods, targeted, strategic, designed to hit the American states and industries that could put the most political pressure on Washington. He reached out to European partners, to Asian trading nations, to the broader international community, signaling that Canada was actively diversifying its trade relationships and reducing its dependence on American markets. He flew to London. He flew to Brussels. He flew to Tokyo. Every trip was a message. Every handshake was a message. The message was, Canada is open for business with the world, and we no longer need Washington's permission to thrive. And then he put a number on it: $160 billion. That is what Canada had lost. That is what the tariffs had cost. That is what Trump had taken. And Carney made clear, through diplomatic channels, through public statements, through the coordinated pressure of allied nations, that this number was not a rhetorical device. It was a demand. Follow the money, and you begin to understand the full scale of what Trump's tariff war actually accomplished, not for America, but against it. The Canadian retaliatory tariffs hit American agricultural exports. Farmers in Michigan, in Wisconsin, in Ohio, states that had voted for Trump, states whose economic vitality depended on Canadian markets, began feeling the consequences. American steel, already struggling against global competition, found itself locked out of Canadian infrastructure projects that had historically been its most reliable source of regional demand. The auto industry, which had lobbied hard for the USMCA precisely because of the integrated North American supply chain, watched that integration unravel in real time. Ford, General Motors, Stellantis, all of them with plants on both sides of the border, all of them watching their logistics costs rise, their production timelines stretch, their profit margins compress. The irony was perfect and brutal. Trump had sold his tariff policy as a way to bring manufacturing back to America, to protect American workers, to make the country strong. But the factories that suffered most were American ones. The workers who lost shifts were American ones. The communities that watched investment flow away were American ones. Because when you disrupt a supply chain that has been optimized over 30 years, you do not automatically rebuild it on your preferred side of the border. You destroy it. And destruction does not discriminate by nationality. Meanwhile, Canada was accelerating a transformation that Trump had inadvertently made inevitable. Carney's government began signing new trade agreements with speed that surprised even Canada's closest allies. A deepened trade relationship with the European Union, expanded energy export agreements with Asian markets that had long coveted Canadian liquefied natural gas, new agricultural deals that replaced American buyers with European and Asian ones. Canada was not just surviving the tariff war. Under Carney's leadership, it was using the crisis as a forcing function, compelling Canadian industry, Canadian exporters, Canadian investors to do what they should have done years ago: reduce their exposure to a single, unpredictable, increasingly hostile neighbor. The deeper truth is this: what Trump did to Canada was not really about trade. It was never really about trade. It was about dominance. It was about demonstrating that the United States, under his leadership, operated by a different set of rules, rules where power mattered more than agreements, where size mattered more than principle, where the strong did what they could and the weak suffered what they must. It was a worldview borrowed from a much darker era of geopolitics, dressed up in the language of economic nationalism and sold to the American public as strength. But strength is not the same as dominance. And dominance without legitimacy is just bullying with a bigger flag. What Carney understood, and what his response demonstrated to the world, is that this kind of dominance has a shelf life. It works until the moment the person being dominated decides they have absorbed enough. It works until the costs of submission exceed the costs of resistance. Canada reached that moment, and when it did, the entire world was watching to see what would happen next. Because Canada was not the only country that had been watching Trump's economic aggression with a growing sense of dread and a private question. If he does this to Canada, what will he do to us? Pause. The answer to that question is why this story matters beyond North America. Every nation that trades with the United States, and virtually every nation on Earth trades with the United States, has been recalibrating its relationship with Washington since Trump's return. The European Union has been building contingency plans. China has been accelerating its alternative trade architecture. India has been quietly expanding relationships that do not run through American institutions. The global trading system that the United States built after World War II, the system that made American leadership synonymous with global stability, is being dismantled piece by the country that created it. And the countries that once looked to Washington for economic leadership are starting to look elsewhere. Canada's resistance, Carney's resistance, is significant not just because of the $160 billion. It is significant because it represents the moment when one of America's closest allies, one of the most trusted voices in the international community, stood up and said out loud what everyone had been saying in private. This is wrong, it is harmful, and it cannot continue. Now let's talk about what comes next. Because this story is not over. It is barely past its opening act. In the short term, the next 30 days, the pressure on both sides will intensify before it eases. Canada's retaliatory tariffs will continue to bite into American export revenues. The American agricultural sector, already facing its own structural challenges, will push harder on the White House for relief. American auto manufacturers will escalate their lobbying because every week the integrated North American supply chain remains disrupted is another week of profit erosion they cannot afford. The political math inside Washington is shifting slowly in ways that Trump's trade advisors will not be able to ignore forever. In the medium term, the scenario splits into two roads. The first road leads to a negotiated resolution, a new framework that replaces or substantially modifies the USMCA, that addresses Canada's legitimate grievances, that includes some form of compensation or trade relief that acknowledges the economic damage of the tariff period. This road is possible. It requires Trump to accept something that does not come easily to him, the appearance of backing down. But it is the road that serves American economic interests, American workers, American companies. It is the road that stops the bleeding on both sides of the border. The second road is darker. If Trump refuses to negotiate in good faith, if he treats Canada's demands as weakness to be exploited rather than grievances to be addressed, then Canada will continue its pivot away from American independence. And that pivot, once completed, cannot easily be reversed. The trade relationships Canada is building right now with Europe, with Asia, with the broader global community, those relationships will become permanent. The market share that American exporters are losing right now will not automatically come back when the tariffs are lifted. Markets, like trust, are hard to rebuild once lost. The second road leads to a North America where the two largest economies on the continent are genuinely estranged, not at war, but no longer partners. And an America without Canada as a reliable, integrated economic partner is a diminished America, whether or not anyone in Washington wants to admit it. The world is watching, and the world is taking notes. Here is what you need to sit with after everything you have just heard. $160 billion was taken from the people of Canada through economic policies that violated agreements, disrupted communities, and treated a sovereign ally as a resource to be exploited rather than a partner to be respected. That money did not appear in a surplus. It did not revitalize American manufacturing. It vanished into the disruption itself, into the lost contracts, the idle plants, the rerouted supply chains, the communities on both sides of the border that paid the price for a trade war that served no one's long-term interest. What Mark Carney did was refuse to let that disappear quietly. He named the number. He put it on record. He made it impossible for history to pretend that this was normal, that this was acceptable, that this was simply how nations treat each other. Because it is not how nations treat each other. Not nations that call themselves allies. Not nations that share a border, a history, a future. What happened to Canada under Trump's tariff regime was a betrayal dressed as policy. And the fact that it required a Mark Carney to make the world see it for what it was says something important. Not just about Trump, not just about Canada, but about the moment we are living in. A moment when the rules are being rewritten in real time, when the institutions that held the global order together are under pressure from the very country that built them, and when the question of who pushes back and how will determine what kind of world emerges on the other side. You are living inside that question right now. Every day that this continues, every day that the tariffs hold and the demands go unanswered and the relationship between these two countries deteriorates further, is a day that the answer becomes clearer, and not necessarily in the direction that makes America stronger. So here's what I need you to think about. Here is the question I want you to take into the comments and answer honestly, because this conversation needs to happen out loud, in public, where people can hear it. If the United States can impose $160 billion in economic damage on its closest ally and call it policy, if it can tear up its own trade agreements, hollow out partner economies, and face no real consequence, what does that tell you about the future of American leadership in the world? And more importantly, what does it tell you about what that leadership is actually for? Leave your answer below, because history is being written right now, and silence is also a choice.